Rules of the SkinWalker Motel. Rule number 1. Turn off the neon sign at exactly 11:15 p.m. and turn it back on at 6:45 a.m. Never before or after. Rule number 2. Ignore any sound coming from the ice machine between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. Never open it during this time. Rule number 3. Room 214 is always under renovation. Never enter, even if the lights are on or noises come from inside. Rule number 4. Answer the phone at exactly 3:33 a.m., but don't say anything. Just listen for exactly 66 seconds and then hang up. Rule number 5. If the vending machine dispenses something that isn't food or drink, don't touch it with bare hands. Dispose of it immediately. Rule number 6. Lock yourself in the supply closet at 5:55 a.m. for exactly 5 minutes. Do not leave early no matter what happens. Rule number 7. Never hand out the key to room 13, no matter who asks for it. Rule number 8. Ignore any guest who seems to be whispering to themselves. Do not interact with them. Rule number 9. If you see someone who looks exactly like you, do not approach them. Rule number 10. Never make direct eye contact with guests after 2 a.m. Rule number 11. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, do not open the door. Rule number 12. If the phone rings incessantly, only answer it on the 4th ring. My name is Ethan Carter, and that night, my life seemed to take yet another step toward complete failure. The town of Twin Pines, where I had grown up and lived my entire life, seemed to have slowly pushed me out, like a body rejecting something foreign. With no other options, I took a job as the night receptionist at the SkinWalker Motel, a roadside inn in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Nevada desert. The name sounded odd, like that creepy internet legend, and uncomfortable even, but the pay was too good to be true. When you're drowning in overdue bills with no way out, you learn to ignore certain red flags. I arrived at the location just before 10 p.m. The exterior was simple, typical of roadside motels. A square, 2-story building painted a faded yellow, with a flickering neon sign that read, Clearly, the letters had needed fixing for years. The hot desert wind made the air shimmer and kicked up dust along the empty road. I was greeted by an older man with a grim expression, sitting in a wooden chair at the reception desk. He watched me with sunken eyes, his wrinkled hands holding a folded piece of paper. "You're Ethan, right?" I nodded, and he handed me the paper firmly. "These are the rules. Follow them to the letter, kid. Don't question it. Just do what's written here." I glanced at the list, trying to process what I was reading. My initial exhaustion was replaced by disbelief. The instructions were so absurd that I let out a short, nervous laugh. "Is this for real?" I asked, but the man didn't answer. He simply stared at me for a few more seconds before muttering, "If you value your life, you'll do what it says." The old man stood, grabbed a battered hat, and walked out the door, leaving me alone. I sat behind the counter, reviewing the rules again. It was hard to take any of it seriously, but the man's tone lingered in my mind. I decided to slip the paper into my pocket and treat it as part of an elaborate prank. The first few hours of the night were uneventful. No guests showed up, and the desert silence was almost comforting. I flipped through an old magazine when, around 3:15 a.m., the phone rang for the first time. The sound was loud and abrupt, as if the device was demanding my attention. I glanced at the clock and remembered the last rule. If the phone rings incessantly, only answer it on the 4th ring. For a moment, I considered ignoring it altogether, but then I figured it might just be the owner checking to see if I was still awake. I let the phone ring 3 more times before picking it up. "SkinWalker Motel, this is Ethan. How can I help you?" There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then, a raspy male voice spoke slowly. "We're waiting for you." The sentence made my heart race. "Who is this?" I asked, but there was no response. The line went dead, leaving only the sound of the dial tone. I stood there, holding the phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My second night at the SkinWalker Motel started off even stranger than the first. After the unsettling phone call and the nearly ridiculous rules, I seriously considered quitting. But with mounting bills and no other options, I returned. It's just a matter of time before I find something better, I told myself as I parked in the same desolate spot as the previous night. The night was warm, but the wind carried an unpleasant, damp dust smell. When I walked in, the heavy air of the motel felt even more oppressive than before. Everything was quiet, except for the faint buzz of the neon sign. It was as if the building itself was waiting for something to happen. The start of my shift was uneventful. I reviewed the keys, checked the room log, and went over the supply inventory. Room 13, as instructed, was still listed as under renovation. Its key remained locked in a drawer, along with a few others for vacant rooms. Shortly after midnight, a man walked through the front door. He was thin, with deep-set eyes that seemed restless, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. He wore a dark coat, despite the heat. "I need a room," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Of course, I replied, trying to sound professional. "We have a few options available. Would you prefer something on the ground floor or the second floor?" He shook his head impatiently. "I want room 13. My body tensed. The rule was clear. Never hand out the key to room 13, no matter who asks. "I'm sorry, sir," I explained, trying to sound casual. "Room 13 is under renovation. I can offer you another." "I don't want another room." His voice cut through the air, sharper now. He leaned over the counter, and his eyes, which had been merely restless before, now looked desperate. "I need room 13. For a moment, I considered giving in, just to make him leave and get some peace. But the warning echoed in my mind. Never hand out the key. "I can't do that," I insisted. "It's out of service." The man began to tremble. His lips moved, muttering something I couldn't understand. Then his voice changed. It grew deeper, almost guttural. "You don't understand." The words came out slowly, as if spoken by something unfamiliar with human speech. I took a step back, trying to hide the growing fear. "If you want another room, I can help. Otherwise," he slammed his hand on the counter, making me jump. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, vanishing into the darkness of the road. I stood there for a few minutes, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Whatever that was, it wasn't normal. When I finally caught my breath, I returned to the counter to check the keys. I needed to make sure the key to room 13 was still there, exactly where I had left it. I opened the locked drawer and scanned through the keys. 1, 2, 3. The key to room 13 was gone. I rummaged through everything, searching, trying to convince myself I had moved it by mistake. But there was no way. I had left it there, and now it was missing. My first thought was that the man had stolen it. Maybe he had taken the key while I was distracted. But it didn't make sense. The drawer had been locked, and I had the only key. A distant noise pulled me from my investigation. Footsteps. They echoed from the hallway on the second floor, the distinct sound of heavy shoes on the wooden floor. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. No guests had checked in that night, and I was certain the place was empty. Someone must have gotten in without me noticing, I thought. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs slowly, trying not to make a sound. The hallway was dark except for the dim light flickering from a bulb on the ceiling. Each step felt heavier, and the footsteps ahead stopped abruptly as I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was empty. I looked toward room 13. The door was closed, but something felt off. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing with each step. There was no sign of anyone, but the air around the room felt colder, almost freezing. That's when I noticed it. The key to room 13 was in the lock. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my hands sweaty and trembling. I knew I shouldn't open that door, but I had to make sure no one was inside. "Hello," I called out, my voice weak. No response, just the heavy silence, which seemed to grow thicker by the second. My hand moved toward the doorknob, but before I could turn it, I heard something from the other side of the door. Slow, deep breathing. I froze. There was no doubt someone was in there, but who or what? I stepped back, trying to shake the thought of opening the door. As I hesitated, the breathing stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. Whispers. They came in multiple voices, distorted and almost unintelligible. But one word stood out clearly. "Ethan." I didn't wait to find out more. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, locking the reception door behind me. I slumped behind the counter, gasping for air. I looked at the clock. There were still hours until dawn, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd survive until then. The third night arrived, and with it came a sense that something was about to happen. Since the incident with room 13 the previous night, my entire body had been on high alert. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow more menacing. I had stopped trying to rationalize things. There was no point in convincing myself it was all just coincidences or cruel pranks. The SkinWalker Motel was wrong. Something malevolent. It was almost 1 a.m. when I first noticed the silhouette. It stood at the glass door separating the reception from the parking lot. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, maybe a trick of the light from the neon sign. But then I made out the distinct outline of a white dress, swaying gently in the breeze. I lifted my eyes from the register log and focused on the figure. It was a girl. She looked no older than 10 at most. Her pale skin was almost translucent under the faint light, and her dark hair hung in messy strands over her shoulders. She was barefoot, hugging her arms around herself as if shielding from the cold. I stood up slowly, my heart already racing. The list of rules blared in my mind like an alarm. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, do not open the door. She hadn't called my name. Not yet. I walked toward the door, trying to remain calm. Maybe it was just a lost child, but something about her unsettled me deeply. Her eyes. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them fixed on me, even from a distance. As I got closer, she began to speak. Her voice was fragile, trembling like a thread about to snap. "Please, let me in. I'm cold." Even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to ignore her, guilt began to creep in. She was just a little girl, alone in the middle of nowhere, in the Nevada desert. Who would leave a child like that outside? "How did you get here?" I asked, keeping my voice firm but not opening the door. "I'm lost," she said, her voice almost breaking into a sob. "Please, I just need a warm place for a minute." My eyes darted to the list. The rules didn't specifically mention children, but something about her plea felt wrong. How could she have gotten here? There were no houses or buildings for miles. And even if she was lost, why wasn't she afraid? "I can't open the door," I said, trying to sound gentle. "I'll call someone to help you. Okay? You just need to wait a little while." The girl tilted her head, as if she didn't understand what I was saying. Then, she stepped closer, pressing her face against the glass. That's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. Her smile. Slowly, her face stretched into a wide, exaggerated grin, as if the very act of smiling was foreign to her. Her lips pulled back unnaturally, revealing small, unnervingly sharp teeth. "Please, Ethan, let me in." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't told her my name. "I can't do that," I repeated, now with a trembling voice. She laughed, a dry, sharp sound that echoed in the night's silence. Then, she began to knock on the door. Not hard, but with a steady, unsettling rhythm, as if marking time. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." The knocking grew louder. With each strike, the glass shook, but somehow didn't break. "Are you afraid of me?" she asked, her smile still plastered across her face. "Go away!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The girl stopped. She stood still for a moment, motionless, the smile finally fading. Then, she tilted her head again, her eyes locking onto mine. "All right," she said, in an almost gentle tone. "You can leave me out here." But someone always ends up opening the door. Before I could react, she vanished. She didn't walk or run. She simply disappeared, as if she had never been there. But she left something behind. On the glass, where her face had pressed, there was a handprint. It looked like it had been made with blood, the fingers unnaturally long and thin, too strange to belong to an ordinary child. I stood there, staring at the stain, my entire body trembling. I didn't dare clean the glass that night. When morning finally came, I looked out at the parking lot. It was empty as usual, but the handprint remained, red and vivid, a stark reminder that the girl, or whatever she was, might return at any time. And maybe next time she wouldn't leave so easily. The fourth night came like a silent storm, carrying a tension that seemed to seep into the air. Since the girl's appearance at the glass, every sound and every movement put me on edge. I began to wonder how much longer I could endure this job without losing my mind. It was close to 2 a.m. when I decided to patrol the hallways. Not that it was required, but staying in the reception area only fueled my nervousness. Besides, I needed to ensure everything was in its place, especially after the incident with room 13. I grabbed my flashlight and walked through the ground floor. All the doors were closed, the silence was absolute, and the only sound accompanying me was that of my own footsteps. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling a chill as I approached the second-floor hallway. The air felt heavier up there, almost as if I were breathing through an invisible barrier. The corridor lights flickered faintly. That's when I saw it. Standing beside the door to room 214 was a figure identical to me. My body froze. It was like looking into a mirror, but that reflection wasn't supposed to be there. The clothes, the posture, even the tense expression on its face. It was a perfect replica of me. The figure did nothing but watch me. Its eyes, although identical to mine, seemed lifeless, as if something crucial was missing. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, pinning me in place like a cornered animal. Room 214. The door still had the makeshift under renovation sign. The figure stood a few steps from it, motionless, as if guarding the room or waiting for me to approach. My mind screamed at me to leave, but something, whether irrational curiosity or sheer terror, kept me rooted to the spot. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, trying to convince my brain it was all just a trick, a hallucination brought on by stress. But at that moment, the figure took a step toward me. That was enough to snap me out of my stupor. I turned on my heel and sprinted down the hallway, racing down the stairs as fast as I could. My feet barely touched the steps, and the sound of my own frantic movements seemed deafening in the motel's oppressive silence. When I reached the reception, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I pressed my back against the wood, struggling to catch my breath. The clock read 2:27 a.m. There were still hours until sunrise, and I was trapped in that place with whatever that thing was. I tried convincing myself it wasn't real, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the events of the previous nights finally catching up to me. But then something caught my attention. There was something on my desk. A message, written in large, hurried letters that hadn't been there when I left to patrol. "You're getting closer." My breath caught in my throat. The words seemed hastily scrawled, as if whoever wrote them had to leave quickly. But closer to what? Before I could process the message, I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps. They echoed from the hallway on the ground floor, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was making them was approaching the reception. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Nothing, but the footsteps continued. I switched off the light, trying to stay hidden, and crouched behind the counter. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be right in front of me. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there, standing on the other side of the counter. And then a voice, low, almost a whisper. "Ethan." I stayed frozen, trying to stifle my panic. Whatever it was didn't move, but the air around me turned icy. The voice came again, closer this time. "You can't escape." I closed my eyes and curled into myself, waiting for it to leave. Minutes passed, and the silence returned. But I didn't move until the first light of dawn began to brighten the horizon. When I finally dared to stand, I looked at the desk again. The message was still there, unchanged. But now, something else had been added next to it. A key. The key to room 214. When I arrived for my shift on the 5th night, something about the atmosphere felt different. It wasn't just the musty smell that clung to the air or the constant hum of the neon sign outside. It was as if the motel itself was waiting for me. I remembered the message from the night before. "You're getting closer," and the key to room 214, now locked in the drawer behind the counter. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but every time I looked at it, I felt as if something was calling me. The first guests of the night arrived around 10 p.m. It was unusual, given how empty the place usually was, but I did my job. A couple, likely in their 40s, requested a room on the ground floor. The woman seemed distracted, almost drowsy, while the man spoke for her. "Room 7 will do," he said, avoiding eye contact. I handed him the key and watched as they headed down the hallway. Something about the way the woman moved unsettled me. Her steps were hesitant, almost disjointed, as if she weren't entirely present. Shortly afterward, 2 more guests arrived. A man in a rumpled suit, with an exhausted expression, asked for room 10. He seemed nervous, constantly wringing his hands, but he didn't say anything beyond the room number. I checked both guests in without any issues, but as the night went on, I began to notice something strange. The silence that typically blanketed the motel was gradually replaced by a low, constant sound, whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I walked through the lobby and down the hallways, I realized the whispers were coming from the rooms. Not all of them, just a few. They sounded like muffled voices, speaking rapidly, almost like a prayer in a language I couldn't understand. I stopped near the door to room 7 and leaned closer to listen. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." The voice was female, raspy, and hurried. But when I touched the door, the whispers abruptly stopped. I backed away and moved toward room 10, where the man in the suit was staying. The whispers there were different, deeper, as if several voices were speaking at once. "He knows. He's listening." My hands began to shake. The rules were clear. Ignore any guest who seems to be whispering to themselves. But it wasn't easy. I was about to head back to the reception when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly, but the hallway was empty. The silence returned for a moment before being replaced by something worse. Whispers. Now, they were coming from all directions, no longer confined to the rooms. It was as if the walls were alive, pulsating with a chorus of voices that grew louder and louder. The words were incomprehensible, but the sound seemed to invade my mind, making me dizzy. I tried to ignore it and keep walking, but the noise followed me. "He's looking. He can't escape. We're watching." And then, all at once, the whispers stopped. A heavy silence fell over the place, more suffocating than the noise had been. I glanced around, a shiver running down my spine. I knew I wasn't alone, but I also knew that whatever was there wasn't human. I hurried back to the reception, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But even there, the whispers seemed to follow me. They were inside my head now, as if they'd found a new space to echo. I turned on the small TV in the corner of the room, hoping to break the silence, but the screen only displayed static. Even so, I could hear the whispers blending with the crackling noise. Closer, closer. The sound was unbearable. I covered my ears, trying to block the voices, but it was no use. They weren't just around me, they were inside me. I looked toward the drawer where the key to room 214 was locked away. A part of me whispered that opening that room might end all of this, but I knew it was a lie. I was trapped in the SkinWalker Motel, and with each passing night, the place seemed to consume me a little more. When morning finally arrived, the guests left as if nothing had happened. None of them looked me in the eye or mentioned the whispers. It was as though the things I experienced every night were meant just for me. But as I tidied up the reception, I noticed something. In the guest logbook, where the name of the occupant of room 10 should have been, there was only a message. You are being watched. The night was unusually quiet. No new guests had arrived since 11 p.m., and the motel's hallways were steeped in an oppressive silence. I should have been relieved, but the calm only heightened my anxiety. It felt as if the very air was bracing itself for something. I sat in the chair behind the counter and rested my head in my hands. Exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm me, for sleepless nights, filled with events that defied any logic, were taking their toll. I tried to close my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet lull me into a brief rest, but my reprieve was short-lived. A sound made me snap my eyes open. Someone was calling my name. Ethan. The voice was low, familiar, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was coming from outside the office, where I had locked myself in after the events of the previous night. I stood up slowly, straining to hear more clearly. Ethan, it's me. Please let me in. My entire body froze. That voice, it couldn't be. It was the voice of Brian, my childhood best friend. Brian. The last time I'd seen him was years ago, before he moved across the country. There was no way he could be here in the middle of the desert at the SkinWalker Motel. Ethan, please. I need to talk to you. My heart started racing. The voice was so real, so convincing, that I almost believed it was truly Brian. But something felt off. My brain wrestled with the urge to open the door. If you hear someone calling your name from outside, do not open the door. The rule echoed in my mind like a warning scream. It can't be you, I whispered to myself, trying to stay rational. Why are you taking so long? It's me, Ethan. The voice outside sounded more urgent now, tinged with desperation and anger. I took a step toward the door, almost without realizing it. My hand brushed against the doorknob, but a cold draft seeped through the cracks, snapping me back to reality. The reception light flickered, casting shadows across the room. For a brief moment, I saw something move on the other side of the door. A quick, almost imperceptible shadow. Every muscle in my body tensed. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Ethan, please, are you really gonna leave me out here? I need you. The pleading tone in the voice almost broke me. Brian had been the one person I cared about before my life fell apart. Hearing his voice brought a flood of painful memories, but also an alert. This wasn't real. And then the voice changed. Open the door, Ethan. It was no longer Brian's voice. It was something deeper, almost inhuman, reverberating like muffled thunder. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair behind me. The door began to shake slightly, as if someone or something was pushing against it with force. You think you're safe in there? The scream that followed was deafening, so loud it made my ears ache. I covered them with my hands, trying to muffle the sound, but it seemed to be coming from inside my head. When it finally stopped, a deathly silence filled the room. For a moment, I thought the worst had passed, but then something moved in the window next to the door. Outside, two glowing eyes stared at me. They weren't human. The pupils were slit-like, predator-like, and emitted an intense, almost hypnotic light. For a moment, everything around me seemed to freeze. The eyes drew closer to the window, so near they seemed as though they might break through the glass. What do you want from me? My voice came out louder than I intended, laced with desperation. The eyes didn't respond. They only watched me, unmoving, until slowly they began to fade, swallowed by the darkness. Silence returned. No voices, no screams, no glowing eyes watching me. But I knew it wasn't over. Something was toying with me, testing my limits, pushing me closer and closer to the edge. I sat down again, trying to steady my breathing. The clock read 4 a.m., but the feeling of being watched was still strong. That night, I couldn't find any rest. I sat there, under the flickering reception light, bracing myself for the motel's next move. I was getting closer, but closer to what? The seventh night arrived heavy, like a storm about to break. The air felt dense, laden with an invisible tension that made my skin crawl. After the incident the night before, rule number 10 was etched in my mind like a death sentence. Never make direct eye contact with guests after 2 a.m. The shift began as usual, with guests trickling in. Some for work, others just passing through for the night. The conversations were brief and routine, but something about them unsettled me. It wasn't the whispers or the strange behaviors. It was the way they looked at me. Their stares weren't normal. They were penetrating, as if they were trying to pull something out of me. Even when I avoided their gaze, I could feel the weight of their eyes. It was past 2 a.m. when everything began to change. I was alone in the reception area, going over the guest log, when I sensed a presence. I looked up to see a woman standing on the other side of the counter. She hadn't been there a second ago. She was tall, with straight black hair, wearing something that resembled an old-fashioned dress, almost out of time. Her skin was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes, I forced myself not to look directly at them, but I could feel the heat of her stare burning into the side of my face. "I need a room," she said, her voice low and drawn out, as though each word took effort. My mouth was dry. I grabbed a random key, barely noticing which one it was, and slid it across the counter, avoiding her gaze. "Room 9, I murmured. She didn't move right away. I stood there, paralyzed, until I finally heard her footsteps retreating. When I dared to look up again, she was already in the hallway, vanishing into the darkness. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, but my relief was short-lived. Around the lobby, other guests began to appear, one by one, emerging from the hallways. They stood there silently. They didn't say anything or make any threatening moves. They just stared at me. I lowered my eyes to the counter, trying to avoid eye contact, but the sensation of being consumed by their stares grew. My heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo through the room. Then I made a mistake. My hand slipped on the polished wood of the counter, and instinctively, I lifted my head to steady myself. For a moment, my eyes met those of the woman from room 9, who had returned and was now standing among the others. Her eyes were black as a bottomless pit, and the instant I looked into them, I was pulled into something that was no longer the SkinWalker Motel. The room around me disappeared. In its place was a vast, infinite space, covered in liquid darkness. The ground pulsed beneath my feet, like living flesh, and the air was thick, reeking of rot and blood. And at the center of it all was something. I can't fully describe what I saw, but I know it was ancient, monstrous. Something my mind wasn't meant to comprehend. It was like staring into the primordial abyss from which all things had emerged. And yet, I could feel it watching me, studying me with a predator's curiosity. Visions flooded my mind. People trapped in eternal torment, their mouths frozen in silent screams. A consuming void that reduced everything to dust. And, above all, eyes, thousands of them, all fixated on me. My mind was on the verge of breaking. "Ethan," the voice snapped me out of the trance. In an instant, I was back in the reception area. A man, ordinary looking and holding a map, had walked into the office. His expression was one of confusion. "Are you all right?" he asked, looking at me with concern. My hands were trembling. The guests who had filled the lobby moments ago had vanished. The woman from room 9 was gone. Everything appeared normal, but I knew it wasn't. I forced a weak smile. "Yes, sorry. Just a bit tired." The man nodded, asking for directions to the highway. As I explained, my words came out jumbled. My body was still trapped in the sensation that something had followed me out of that vision. When he left, I sat down again and took a deep breath. I glanced at the list of rules, as if they could offer some comfort. But all I could think about were the woman's eyes and what they had shown me. They were waiting for me, and with every passing moment, I felt there was nowhere left to run. The SkinWalker Motel felt heavier that night, as if the building itself were breathing in slow, labored gasps. Everything seemed wrong, from the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks to the never-ending flicker of the neon sign outside. A little after midnight, I decided to check the keys in the drawer. It was a routine I'd adopted in recent nights, a way to make sure everything was in its place, even when the rest of the motel wasn't. But something was wrong. The key to room 13 was missing. I had locked it away, I was sure of it. Ever since the incident with the man demanding that room, I'd taken extra precautions to keep it secure. The drawer was locked, as always, and I still had the only key to open it. So how could it have vanished? A chill of anxiety ran down my spine. I glanced at the clock. 2:10 a.m. Too late for anything good. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking. Maybe I'd accidentally put the key somewhere else, or maybe the manager had taken it. But those explanations felt hollow. Summoning what little courage I had, I walked toward the hallway where room 13 was located. The air grew colder as I approached, and an overwhelming sense of wrongness filled the space, as though I were intruding on a place I shouldn't be. When I reached it, I saw something that made me freeze. The lights in the room were on. The door was closed, but a thin line of yellow light escaped from underneath it. My heart pounded. There were no registered guests in that room. It was supposed to be locked, out of use. I took a cautious step closer, trying not to make a sound. That's when I heard the laughter. It was muffled, as though coming from several people at once, but there was something profoundly unsettling about it. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was raspy, drawn out, mocking something only they understood. "This isn't real," I muttered to myself, but the words didn't even sound convincing to my own ears. The laughter stopped abruptly. Before I could react, a sharp knock broke the silence. Knock, knock, knock. I stepped back, my legs trembling. The knocks weren't loud, but they echoed down the corridor like thunder. I tried to retreat, but the sound persisted, accompanied by more muffled laughter. The hallway seemed to stretch longer, as if the exit were miles away. My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately. When I finally made it back to the reception, I locked the office door behind me. My heart was still racing, but the silence around me was almost deafening. I tried to compose myself, but when I turned to the counter, something made me stop again. There was a note on the desk, written in hurried handwriting. "What's in room 13 is your next rule." My mind spun. Who had written that? How had the note appeared? The message made me feel like a pawn in a game I didn't understand. It was clear that whatever force inhabited the SkinWalker Motel wasn't just toying with me. It was testing me, pulling me deeper into its clutches. I looked back toward the hallway, where room 13 loomed like an open wound in the motel's structure. I knew that at some point, I would have to face whatever was inside. But I didn't know if I'd come out intact, so that moment wouldn't be now. The clock read 3:42 a.m., and the SkinWalker Motel was quieter than usual. After the note on my desk and the incident with room 13, my body felt like it was locked in a constant state of tension. Every sound, every shadow turned into something potentially threatening. I was lost in thought when the doorbell rang, shattering the silence. I looked toward the entrance and saw a man standing there, holding a small backpack. He seemed ordinary at first glance, but something about him didn't feel right. He walked to the counter with slow, measured steps, as if every movement required careful calculation. His posture was stiff, and his eyes avoided mine. "I need a room," he said in a low voice. I nodded, trying to appear professional, but there was something about the way he spoke that made my skin crawl. I grabbed the logbook, but as I jotted down the details, I could feel his gaze on me. Even without looking up, I could sense that he was studying me. "Room 109 is available," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. When I raised my eyes to hand him the key, I noticed something that made me freeze for a moment. His face was changing. It wasn't a natural movement. His features were shifting, stretching, and contracting in small spasms. The skin around his eyes seemed to vibrate, and his jaw made faint popping sounds, as if it weren't properly aligned. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't. His face continued to shift, as though something beneath his skin was struggling to find the right shape. "Is something wrong?" he asked, tilting his head. I swallowed hard, trying to regain my composure. "No, sir. Here's your key." I slid the key across the counter, my hands trembling slightly. He picked it up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and turned toward the hallway. I watched as he walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the motel's silence. Then I noticed something else disturbing. He was leaving a trail. Dark, viscous marks stained the floor where he stepped, glistening faintly in the dim light. A metallic smell began to fill the air, making my stomach turn. He didn't look back as he disappeared down the hallway toward room 109. When he was gone, a mix of panic and curiosity consumed me. My instincts told me not to get involved, but I had to know what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the hallway, stopping at the entrance. The trail of dark liquid snaked along the floor, faintly shimmering under the light. With every step I took, the metallic smell grew stronger, and the air around me felt heavier. I stopped in front of room 109. There was no sound coming from inside, but the atmosphere felt alive. I was about to retreat when I heard a muffled noise. It was wet, almost like flesh being torn apart. My hand shook on the flashlight. I took a step back, but before I could move any farther, a shadow darted past the crack under the door. It wasn't the guest. It was something larger, writhing unnaturally, as if it were compressed into a space too small to contain its form. I didn't wait to see more. I ran back to the reception, locking the door behind me. My hands were ice cold, and the sound of my own heartbeat pounded in my ears. I glanced at the clock. There were still hours until sunrise, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. The trail left by the guest was burned into my mind, along with the sound of something inhuman moving inside room 109. I sat behind the counter, convincing myself I wouldn't check anything else that night. The 10th night began before I even stepped through the door of the SkinWalker Motel. Something in the air seemed to repel me, a sensation that I was crossing a line I could never return from. As I walked to the reception desk, memories of the previous nights piled up in my mind. The man with the shifting face, the cryptic note about room 13, the horrifying vision of black eyes and the infinite abyss. And always, at the center of it all, were rooms 13 and 214. I began my shift with a grim determination. Something inside me knew there was a pattern to all of this. Every rule, every strange guest, every eerie occurrence felt like part of a macabre play I couldn't fully understand, but I was determined to try. It was around 2 a.m. when things started to make sense. I was walking through the ground floor hallway, following the same routine I did every night, when I noticed something strange near the ice machine. A faint light flickered on the wall beside it, revealing what looked like carvings. I moved closer and shone my flashlight on them. They were symbols, crude but deliberate, as though they had been etched into the wall with something sharp. A pattern of circles, twisted lines, and shapes I didn't recognize. The air around them was colder, and the metallic smell returned, reminding me of the guest from room 109. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling their rough texture, and then I realized something that made me pull back. They were wet, as if they had been freshly made. My mind raced, This wasn't the first time I'd noticed something strange near the ice machine. The whispers from the second night, the sounds calling me. All of it seemed to point to this specific area as a focal point of the motel's strange energy. I looked around, searching for more clues, and realized the symbols weren't confined to that one wall. I followed the hallway and found more marks scattered throughout, hidden in corners and behind furniture. They formed a pattern that ended precisely between rooms 13 and 214. A shiver ran down my spine as I tried to piece it all together. The rules, I realized, weren't just instructions for my safety. They were something deeper, something that seemed to keep me trapped in a cycle. I returned to the reception desk, my mind buzzing with the discovery. I grabbed the list of rules and stared at it with fresh eyes. Each one seemed less like a warning and more like a piece of a puzzle. Turn off the neon sign. Ignore the sounds. Answer the call. Lock yourself in the closet. The pattern was there, but its meaning still eluded me. I slumped into my chair, the crumpled paper clutched in my hands. I closed my eyes and tried to connect the dots, but a growing sense of dread took hold of me. Whatever this was, I wasn't just a victim. I was a part of something bigger, a dark ritual that seemed to revolve around the motel and me. When I opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't alone. On the counter in front of me was something that hadn't been there before. A sheet of paper identical to the one with the rules. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The words written on it were simple, but they made my legs weaken. You are part of the ritual. Do not break the rules or you will be next. My hands went cold, and the paper slipped to the floor. I looked around, but the reception was empty. The clock read 2:45. There were still hours until sunrise, and for the first time, I began to believe I might never see daylight again. That same night, I started making rounds through the motel to distract myself, but something disturbing happened. I froze. My feet felt glued to the ground as the scene before me unfolded like something out of a nightmare. A hooded figure, cloaked in black that seemed to absorb all the light around it, held a strange, twisted key, irregular as if it had been forged in a place where the laws of physics didn't apply. With a slow, deliberate movement, the figure inserted the key into the lock of room 214. The sound of metal scraping against the door made me shiver, but what happened next was worse. The door didn't open like a normal door. It disintegrated, as if turned to dust. A whirl of shadows and light took its place, spinning in a vortex too fast to follow. Beyond it, I saw something that shouldn't exist. The space inside room 214 was vast, infinite, completely disconnected from reality. The walls, if they could even be called that, rippled like water, reflecting a sickly, pale glow. The floor seemed to stretch forever, covered in a substance that resembled shattered mirrors. At the center of this impossible place stood an ancient wooden table, carved with symbols etched deeply into its surface. On it sat a single object that drew my gaze, a black-framed mirror with details that seemed alive, writhing like tiny creatures trapped within. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes locked onto the reflection. In the mirror, I didn't just see myself. I saw more. The version of me in the reflection wasn't me. It was older, the face scarred in ways I didn't recognize, the eyes hollowed by an icy void. There was a cruelness to that reflection, a distinct disdain that made my skin crawl. "You are seeing," a voice echoed from inside the portal. I looked at the hooded figure, but its head was lowered, and no part of its body was visible beneath the cloak. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating like distant thunder. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice too small for the weight of the scene. The reflection in the mirror moved, but I didn't. The older version of me tilted its head, studying me, its lips curling into a slow, calculated smile. "You already know who I am," it replied, but the voice wasn't coming from the mirror. It came from inside my head. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in the hallway. Hot tears began streaming down my face. It felt like the reflection was draining something from me, as though every second I looked at it was stealing fragments of my sanity. "You cannot escape, Ethan," the voice said again. "You never could. You've always been a part of this." The reflection raised a hand, and the mirror's surface began to ripple like water. Something was trying to emerge, a shadow taking shape slowly. I spun on my heels and ran. I didn't look back, not even when the terrible sounds came from room 214. Glass shattering, wood creaking, and a scream that sounded like mine but was distorted beyond recognition. I ran to the reception, locking myself in the office. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I went to the desk, hoping to find a message or some warning. But this time there was nothing, only emptiness. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but one thing was clear. Room 214 wasn't just a room. It was a portal, an entryway to something far beyond my understanding. And now I knew that reflection, that older version of me, was waiting for what I didn't yet know. But the answer felt inevitable. Despair made my heart race faster than I thought possible. I knew I couldn't stay at the SkinWalker Motel. The rules weren't my protection, they were my prison. Every passing night, every impossible event I witnessed, made me more convinced that the motel was preparing me for something horrifying, something I couldn't face. So on that final night, I decided to end it. If the motel wanted to keep me there, I would break the rules. I would do the opposite of what was expected, force those forces, or whatever they were, to reveal themselves. It was risky, but it was my only chance. "You want to play with me?" I whispered, my voice filled with desperate courage. At 4:33, the phone rang. I answered on the first ring. This time, there was no silence like before. Instead, a cacophony of voices flooded my ears, all speaking at once in languages I couldn't understand. Words overlapped, whispers turned to screams, and the sound seemed to burrow into my mind. I clenched my teeth and endured it. When I finally hung up, the entire motel seemed to shudder. Lights flickered, doors slammed, and the smell of burning filled the air. I went to room 13. The key had mysteriously returned to the drawer, and I grabbed it, walking down the hallway with determined steps. The corridor felt longer, the shadows deeper. With every step, I heard muffled laughter, faint knocks, and the sound of something slithering along the walls. When I reached the door to room 13, the metal of the doorknob felt like it was pulsing beneath my hand. I turned the key. Second rule broken. The door opened with a sound like air being sucked out, revealing what seemed to be an absolute void. Inside, the space was larger than the motel should have allowed. The floor was covered in a black, glistening liquid that reflected my distorted face as shapeless figures moved in the shadows, like predators closing in on their prey. A sound began to echo, a mix of voices and something like a continuous scream, growing louder and louder. I didn't wait to see what came next. I ran. The motel was alive now, vibrating around me, every wall pulsing, every light flickering. Doors that had been closed flew open, revealing impossible hallways that shouldn't exist. Shadows moved everywhere, some tall, others crawling along the floor, all of them watching me as I sprinted back to the reception. The phone rang incessantly. I reached the reception, where a strong, inexplicable wind was sweeping papers and objects into the air. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the exit. The glass doors burst open with a crack, as if something was shoving me out. When I stepped into the parking lot, the sky was pitch black. No stars, no moon. A whirlwind of shadows swirled around the motel, and the sound of laughter and screams filled the air. I got into my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, and I sped off without looking back. The deserted road stretched out before me, illuminated only by my headlights. The chaotic sounds of the motel faded into the distance until there was only silence. I thought I had escaped. For a moment, relief washed over me, and a bitter laugh escaped my lips. Then the phone rang. I looked at the screen. The number was unrecognizable, but my blood ran cold when I saw the message that accompanied the call. "You can run, but you'll never forget." I didn't answer. I let the phone ring until it stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left me. The SkinWalker Motel was far behind now, but something had followed me. The road stretched endlessly before me, and the sky above remained as black as the darkness I had seen inside room 13. I had escaped, but deep down, I knew I would never be free.